Matthias? Okay.
Do you want us to come up here?
Yeah, you will come up when I call you. Yeah. And then, and you've identified the seat down there.
So I just waiting for you to pronounce my name.
I've been rehearsing it. Ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly ask you to take your seats, finish up your breakfast quickly so we can get going with this very important conversation this morning. I do know that so many of you have other commitments alongside UNGA, and we want to get going with our program so that we can release you to attend your day's events. Kindly take your seats, please. You will see your names on the chair, and let's get going. Thank you so much. Last few seconds, the last coffee grab before we get going. We have an audience joining us online, live stream, so I'm sure they're salivating as they're watching you have breakfast without them. So I'm giving you 30 more seconds to gather yourselves and take a seat, please, so we can get started. Thank you. And just to the panelists, do take your seats in the front. I will call you up when it is your turn to speak. Right. Going, gone. Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, my name is Ridi Kabi. I'm a journalist from Johannesburg, South Africa, based here in Washington. I'm very glad to be invited to moderate what is an urgent conversation, but that must be followed up by action. The Secretary General of the United Nations reminded us 5 days ago that climate action is dwarfed by the scale of the climate challenge. I'm just going to say that again because there's a disparity, and it means that the call to action is not just platitude and a talk shop. This is urgent. There must be action. Climate action is dwarfed by the scale of the climate challenge. We are preparing for COP28 in a couple of weeks. But let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that we had COP26, where adaptation finance was committed to. Delegates, decision makers committed to doubling adaptation finance. But at COP27, it did not quite receive the same level of attention that it should have. What does that mean? It means that political will was not there at COP27. It means that we have a challenge to return adaptation financing high up on the political agenda. Again, we were all here experiencing and witnessing extreme weather in the last summer, and that is projected to continue. It's the UN again that is telling us, using the best minds and the best scientists, the best data, that people are starting to die from climate-related illnesses. So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to act. Where is the financing going to come from? What ideas do you have today to put adaptation financing high up on the agenda? Because it is true, we are no longer facing climate warming, we are facing climate boiling. Everybody, everywhere is affected, and those from poorer countries disproportionately so. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this high-level roundtable headway for adaptation. Let me welcome our keynote speech delivered by Anders Tang Friborg, Under Secretary for Foreign Policy for Denmark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very good pronunciation of my name. It's not easy. But just to say, I'm very honored to be the one welcome you to this headway for adaptation. And I'm doing it on behalf of Denmark and Bangladesh. I'm very happy to do it on behalf of both countries. So my sincere gratitude to everyone who is here today, and a big thanks to DanChurchAid, which we could not do this without, and the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group. So thank you very much. I have some prepared notes. I will start by them, but I actually asked Birgitte from DanChurchAid whether I could use the first paragraph of the thing they have produced here. You did it as a moderator just now, putting a little bit of context here, but I thought it was so succinct what was written here that I just want to quote it, the first paragraph, because it reminds us why we are actually here. This summer, the world temporarily touched 1.5 degrees warming threshold twice, with floods, heat waves, wildfires making the headlines daily. In the word of the Secretary General, we are moving from an era of global warming to an era of global boiling, and adaptation is no longer optional. It's a critical. It is a critical response to rapidly escalating and devastating climate disasters, which all states, municipalities, companies, investors, NGOs, and local communities now face. It couldn't be said better, so I think that's why we're here today. COP26 urges developing nations to at least double their collective provisions for adaptation financing from 2019 levels by 2025. And Denmark are committed to meet this target. We intend to increase our grant-based climate financing to the highest level ever in 2024, lifting the dedicated climate financing to 30% of the ODA budget, and 60% of this will go to adaptation. The development and agreement of a framework for the global goal on adaptation at COP28 offers the opportunity to re-evaluate adaptation at the global stage. Global goals on adaptation must be simple and based on existing frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals, while taking into consideration national circumstances. Locally led adaptation can leverage the enormous potential of communities to develop and implement solutions. Empowering local stakeholders can accelerate the implementation of effective and fair measures. However, relying solely on public financing is not sufficient. Our development financing need to act as a catalyst for attracting private investors. And Denmark, we are intensifying our endeavors to mobilize private capital through blended finance. Last year, we launched a pilot phase introducing development guarantees. The aim is to mobilize 3 times our guarantees in private capital for climate investments. We must create innovative instruments to render private ventures more appealing and thereby multiplying the impact of public investments. This is when progress truly begins to accelerate. Improving access to adaptation finance is also a part of the equation. A first step is to address the high transactional cost in the application process. The need for simplified access and streamlined processes is crucial, addressing the need to reduce bureaucracy and enable more efficient use of resources. My last point is that the UN General Assembly provides a unique platform to catalyze global action, and that's why we are here today, to leverage the platform for meaningful change. We must remember that climate adaptation finance is not just about numbers and dollars, it's also about lives and livelihoods and the future of our planet. It's about justice, equity, and solidarity with those who are most affected by the consequences of climate change. Let us take this opportunity to lay the foundation for a course towards a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all, setting the stage for progress at COP28. An ambitious outcome at the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement will be a key deliverable. The global stocktake must be a turning point and a united signal to the world that we intend to live up to our commitment and advance real action on adaptation. So thank you very much for your presence, and I'm looking forward to the discussions then and the result of what comes out of this exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anders Tang Friborg, Under Secretary of Foreign Policy. I think the word that stood out for me, a lot stood out, but you used the term justice, that it is about justice. And that's what climate action is about. It is about justice. It is about reestablishing our human connections and thinking very carefully about how our actions have a debilitating impact on other people with whom we share the planet and on the planet itself. These matters cannot be fixed by speeches. They will not be fixed by verbal commitments. They will be fixed by action. Thank you so very much. And now we get a keynote from Bangladesh delivered by Sabir Chowdhury, Special Envoy to the Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ridi, for that kind introduction. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good morning. Thank you, Anders, for setting the scene and welcoming all of the delegates. I would like to do likewise on behalf of Bangladesh. And let me first say that the fact that we are having this event jointly sponsored by Bangladesh and Denmark in itself is significant. You know, when we are looking at being aspirational and achieving goals, there can be no alternative to global solidarity. And when you have a very progressive country in the so-called North, collaborating and engaging with one in the so-called South, I think there you have the foundations of what could be a much more global solidarity and how it might actually look like. So Denmark, of course, is a very important development friend and partner of Bangladesh. And it's very good that we are now also bringing climate within the scope of that overall cooperation. Anders, you have rightly laid the importance, and you've talked about the global stocktake that we are going to have. But let me then come from a slightly different angle and try to frame the discussions in terms of why adaptation is so important. Very briefly, and I'm not going to give you a course on UNFCCC or the COP process, but if you remember, we started off with mitigation. So the first decade was focused on mitigation. And then we realized that we were not doing enough of it. There were impacts, and then we brought adaptation into the scene. And then 10 years down the road, which is now, we realize that we have not done enough of either mitigation or adaptation, and we are talking about loss and damage. So when we are having a discussion on adaptation, it has to be a dynamic discussion that also brings in mitigation as well as loss and damage. And how does that happen? Because the reason why we have this pressure on adaptation today and why we are every day talking about higher and higher thresholds in terms of needs is because there has not been enough mitigation. And the global goal that we have now set of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is no comfort zone. You know, look at what is happening in the world today at 1.1. But the 1.5 should not be seen as a political target. It is a physical limit which we cannot afford to cross. And so to me, certainly in the long term, if you're talking about sustainable adaptation, mitigation is the best way to achieve that. So that is number one. Number two is, if we can adapt effectively, if we have the requisite resources, then the pressure on loss and damage is going to be less. We don't want to have a world where we pass everything on to loss and damage. That's not the way to go about it. That's not very smart. So this is the critical importance of adaptation. And you know, when we talk about loss and damage, of course, we are hoping that in the coming COP, it's going to be operational, there'll be money on the table, and money will actually be disbursed. But let us look at it in terms of a dynamic relationship between the three. I think that is very, very important. So it also gives us the message that if we fail to cap temperature increase to 1.5, then really whatever we try to do in terms of adaptation will not have the desired result. We cannot go on adapting indefinitely. Resilience is not a concept that you can say you can be resilient forever. So adaptation depends on mitigation, to a large extent. Of course, in the immediate and the shorter term, we have to respond to the needs. We have to stand by the people, and we have to make sure that they have the finances. And then, how do we then take adaptation to be the central focus in terms of both pushing us to mitigate and at the same time reducing the burden on loss and damage? So I think this is a dynamic which is very important. Of course, we are being aspirational and we are talking about doubling adaptation finance by 2025. But it is also important to have a very candid discussion on why we haven't achieved the target so far. Why hasn't the funding come through as promised? We know that the science is as conclusive as it has ever been. We have IPCC reports which every country signs on to. So why is science not guiding the actions and decisions that we need? That is a fundamental question we have to ask. And not because we are trying to portion blame, but because it is important for us to understand what are the constraints. So when new commitments are made, we don't want to see those same constraints in play. I think that is very, very important. And also, I think when we talk about adaptation, we say that what happens in Bangladesh or LDC or a small island developing state is not going to stay there. It is going to cross the oceans and cross the 7 seas and touch each and every part of the world. So by investing in adaptation in Bangladesh and other vulnerable countries, you are actually doing it for your own interest. So it is enlightened self-interest. That's how I would put it. Because by serving the needs of others, you're actually serving the needs for yourselves. And it also shortens the learning curve for countries in the north, because you can learn from the experience of Bangladesh. You can see what has worked, what could work better. So I think this is certainly a very important discussion. And when we have the global stock take, and in fact, we are going to be having the first meeting today, I'm sure this is going to feature very, very prominently in those discussions. And it has to be a package. It cannot be an either-or approach where, okay, we are going to do this for adaptation, but we are going to ease off in terms of mitigation. That's not going to happen. You cannot have a situation where you say, okay, if I'm going to give you funds for loss and damage, it is going to be funds that is coming from the adaptation budget. So I think we should all be aware of that and recognize the needs as they are, because it is critical and things are actually they're getting from bad to worse. So what is happening this year, next year it's going to be even worse. And the pace at which it is happening is actually taking everyone by surprise. We all know about the science. So really, when we look at the COP process and we look at consensus, because we don't have an approved rules of procedure, very unfortunate. We were supposed to do that in the first COP. But so far, we don't have a rules of procedure. In the absence of a rules of procedure, we go on the base of consensus. And consensus means, unfortunately, lowest common denominator, something that everyone can agree on. And so we water down the ambition to the point that is only text, and it doesn't actually convert to any meaningful action. So that's something we have to do. So consensus, yes, because that's the essence of multilateralism, but it has to be based on science. It has to be based on what science says. And the science, as I've said, is as clear as at any time in the past. The other important point for us, it's appropriate, of course, it's urgent, it's important, it's an imperative that we talk about adaptation, but let us also define climate finance. We don't have a definition for climate finance. So when we talk about the billions or millions or even trillions, hopefully, as the COP president has said, it's going to be $2.4 trillion every year. How do we count that money? Is it actually money that is meant additionally for adaptation? Is it new and additional funding? Or is it other funds, including ODA, which is being repackaged as adaptation funding? So unless we get the basics right, unless we all have a very clear understanding of what climate finance, at the moment, it's a very general and a very convenient understanding that anything that's to do with climate is climate finance, but that's not going to work. So that is also important. And hopefully, through this discussion that we have today, I think we are able to take this narrative forward, and all of us let us understand and realize that the whole package is important, and it's not a time to have trade-offs. That is very important. I think countries have to come to the table in good faith. So, okay, I will look the other way when it comes to mitigation. If I'm going to help you with loss and damage, that's not going to work. So when we talk of a whole of government approach, whole of society approach, I think this has to be a whole of climate change discourse that we are going to do. So I certainly would once again wish to add my welcome to the one that Anders has given. And I really hope that the outcomes and the deliberations and the outputs that we have today will be important for not just Denmark and Bangladesh, but for all of the countries, because at the end of the day, it is global solidarity, it is one family, and it is one planet A. Thank you very much.
Special Envoy to the Honorable Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Mr. Sabir Chowdhury, thank you so very much. That was very robust and I think hard-hitting, and as it had to be. And I really appreciate the historical context, because it's so easy to gather at events like this and pat ourselves on the shoulder that we've done something great without reflecting on what we committed to, what we didn't achieve. So thank you very much for reminding us. Finance adaptation is our key theme this morning, but the historical context matters. Thank you. Let me welcome, I mentioned earlier that we are preparing for COP28 and that we want to put adaptation financing high on the political agenda, and the build-up to that must begin. We will hear now from COP28 presidency keynote speech delivered by His Excellency Adnan Amin, COP28 CEO.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's getting to the end of the climate week at the UN, and it's becoming very intense, so there's many things going on. But let me start by saying how much I appreciated the opening remarks, because I think you really touched on all the critical points. Ambassador, Excellency, Special Envoy, I think the way you framed the issue is very clear to us that it's not a choice between mitigation and adaptation. It's both of the above. It is really to intensify our efforts, but at the same time, I think one of the important things that we have to understand is that in the process that we've been in up to now, the level of implementation we have seen on adaptation, despite all of the commitments that we've seen on the table, has been very poor, has not really been up to the task. I see Mr. Chap again sitting here. We talk often about the implications of climate and the adaptation requirements. And what we've seen is that this debate about whether we should be investing in adaptation or in mitigation has really begun to sidetrack where we need to be looking. We have an opportunity now. We've talked about COP28 as being the COP where we achieve transformational change, the COP where we course correct, and the COP on the basis of science and evidence that we really chart a new way forward, given that this is the year of the global stocktake, and the synthesis report, the scientific synthesis report we have now, gives us very clear guidelines on what's expected to happen. It's remarkable when you see the impact of some of the events around the world. The most recent, Derna in Libya, where 8 months of rain fell in a day, wiped out thousands of lives, homes, an entire city. This is the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with. And sometimes when you reflect, I was out of the climate discussion for a couple of years. I come back and I find the same discussion going on. And when you look at the scale of the challenge with what we're actually doing to address it, it's a matter of intense concern. And it's a matter of intense concern to the presidency, which is why we focused on an action agenda that really begins to pinpoint where adaptation action needs to be taken in the short term. So we are making the call to countries to come to the table again. And I think Mr. Chowdhury talked about the status of the negotiation and the issues on the table very compellingly, which is the global goal on adaptation, which is going to frame our action, provide us with the priorities, provide us with the implementation framework, is still far from finalization. It has to be finalized at COP28. And we are putting a lot of emphasis in the negotiation on the global goal, that we must come to an agreement on very clear global goal that gives us the pathway to implementation for the future. We also have the tool of the national adaptation plans with us. And this is not just an exercise of reshuffling one thing or another into a new plan, and then you have all of these plans that exist and nothing ever happens. It's a serious endeavor. And yesterday, I don't know how many of you listened to the COP president when he spoke at the closing of the Secretary General Summit. But what he said was that we want this COP to be honest about what's needed, what must happen. And we've danced around the issue long enough. National adaptation plans for developing countries require action both by developing countries and by international partners. By developing countries, because national adaptation plans require national planning capabilities, allocation of resources, priorities on implementation in government to begin to change to address adaptation, but at the same time, at the heart of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention is the principle of international solidarity, which is how do countries that are in a better position, that have some level of historic responsibility for climate change, step up and be serious about what's going to happen in terms of collaboration. I think this is critical. And we have to be honest about this discussion. It's not a finger-pointing exercise. It's a collective goal that we have to achieve, and we have different responsibilities in achieving that goal. So we need to bring that together at COP28. We need to prioritize what's happening with adaptation, and we need to talk about finance. We are calling for the doubling of the global goal for the adaptation fund. We see 40 billion as a floor, not as a ceiling. I think that there needs to be a lot more ambition on how we are financing the adaptation fund. We're a bit concerned that the very important commitments that were made at Glasgow on the adaptation fund, we've begun to see backsliding on some of those commitments. And I don't think that in this environment, looking at the state of the world and looking at the impacts of climate we see every day, that this is something that's a responsible way to proceed. So we need that level of seriousness to be brought back. Developing countries must step up and take national actions, but developed countries have to also take up their responsibilities for international cooperation. Adaptation is discussed sometimes a little bit in the abstract. So on the one hand, Mr. Chop again is very familiar with this. He's been helping us actually to develop that. We see increased food insecurity associated with climate around the world. We see, the Horn of Africa has suffered 5 years of drought. We've begun to see movements of people. We've begun to see potential conflicts as people move into different areas, and the potential for migration related to climate impacts is a real one. And it is only scaling. So how do we address sustainable agriculture, food security, reorienting agriculture, both in terms of addressing the food needs of the population, as well as the climate impacts that agriculture has? How do we focus on regenerative agriculture? How do we address the biodiversity implications for modern agricultural techniques? And how do we come back to a sustainable system that's capable of supporting the world's population? Food security is one of them. Health is one of them. The energy around health, since we identified it as a priority at COP28, is immense. We launched this at the World Health Assembly. The world's health ministers are absolutely vested now in this agenda. We are beginning to see health impacts associated with climate that are beginning to undermine economies, global health, and it's time for us to really start to create a kind of more resilient health system that's capable of managing the threats that we're going to see with climate change. We saw during the COVID crisis, where was international cooperation? What happened when we needed solidarity in the face of a global pandemic, and what was the impact on the healthcare facilities, especially in the developing world? The developed world was hardly able to cope with the implications of the pandemic. The collapse of public health systems in developing countries was a real possibility. And as we see the growth of health impacts coming out of climate, how do we align ourselves to start to address those kind of issues? So we have two calls. One is, let's create the framework for implementation, and let's be serious about it. Let's talk seriously about the financial flows that are required. Let's talk seriously about what national adaptation planning needs to be. But at the same time, let's start moving on some of the critical threats that we face as a global humanity. I won't take too much of your time. I know there are many other events happening. In fact, I'll have to run quite soon, but I really appreciate having this opportunity. Your Excellencies, thank you so much. And I see many friends in the audience. Count on your participation, on your support to really move the adaptation agenda at COP28. Thank you.
Thank you so much to His Excellency Adnan Amin, and we are obviously empathetic and understanding that there are many events today. So as you see people moving along, that is the reason. This door will remain closed. There is a door just at the back there, and that is the door that you will use if you have another commitment to go to. As you were speaking, I'm looking at the numbers, and they are absolutely staggering, even for somebody who's not a maths and stats boffin like myself, that the OECD estimating international public funds for adaptation reached $28.6 billion in 2020, but that adaptation finance needs are estimated to be 5 to 10 times greater than current international adaptation flows. That is a huge, huge deficit, a huge, huge gap that is expected to widen by 2030. So these are urgent matters. And thank you once again for reminding us about that tragic intersection between what's happening on the climate, on the global warming, climate change front, and the impacts on health and well-being and our stability. Thank you very much. And I love the connection about the global solidarity, the solidarity that we need as citizens of the world. Thanks indeed. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a panel discussion, and for our online participants and guests, this is where we really appreciate your participation as we delve into these themes. The key question that I do want to ask our panelists this morning is, what are the solutions? Which solutions and initiatives are needed to close the adaptation finance gap? One speaker spoke about consensus being the lowest common denominator, the low-hanging fruit. I think that's what you said, low-hanging fruit. We've got the consensus. So now, what are the challenging aspects? What are the solutions? What are the initiatives that we need? Where is the money going to come from? Will it be scaled up by public finance? Do we need to be more innovative and ask a little bit more of ourselves? So let me welcome from the UK, Graham Stewart, UK Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero. You can take a seat, any seat that you want. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask you to pray for me as I say this name. But after you've prayed, you applaud me if I get it right. From Samoa, we welcome Honorable Toe Ole Sulusulu Cedric Schuster. Minister, how did I do? Great. Yes! From the Netherlands, Excellency Pascal Grottenhuis, Vice Minister. Welcome. Thank you. Global Center on Adaptation, Ede Jorge Ijas Vasquez, Senior Advisor on Africa. You will be representing GCA. I must say, GCA is a broker. They facilitate collaboration and adaptation initiatives, so a very important voice in our panel discussion. Secretary General Asif Saleh from BRAC. Again, BRAC is a big NGO working on the ground. We want to hear your perspectives as well. Thank you. Okay, so let me start with BRAC, because I think when you are on the ground, you come with case studies, perspectives, and observations that we all ought to reckon with? What do you see on the ground that ought to inform our adaptation conversations and action?
Thank you so much. I was just in a coastal town of Bangladesh 2 weeks ago, and I met this farmer over there who basically was telling me that my son, his son basically, has never seen a paddy field, who's like 4 years old. And this is in an area where he grew up, the farmer grew up, and he could get lost in a paddy field, rice field. So this is within a generation, within 25 years, this has changed, right? And essentially, this is the sort of the slow onset changes that we are seeing. It's not visible, it's not in your face, but people are moving. People are moving because they are losing their livelihood. There's basic services like waters and others are very, very difficult to have. Women have to travel miles just to get some basic potable drinking water. So, we have heard about Libya, we have heard about Pakistan. One of the things that was very interesting in last year's COP was that the tagline of Pakistan stall, what happened in Pakistan will not stay in Pakistan. And again, what happens in Bangladesh and others is not going to stay in Bangladesh. So what we do over there, what sort of solutions we come up with there, I think is going to be guiding the rest of the world as well. Now, the question becomes, you asked the question about solution, and we have heard from His Excellency about adaptation being quite vague. Now, one of the things we are trying to unpack and demystify is that what really is meant by adaptation. And essentially, when we look at adaptation, it's not, often people think that it's going to be like a really brand spanking new shiny solutions that needs to come into play. It's not. It is really at the end of the day about poverty. People living in the margins suffers the most on these kinds of things, any kind of crisis, right? So we look at it in 3 ways, essentially. One, first, that basic critical services are needed. So water should be available. Food security should be available. Basic health support should be needed. Second thing is about losing of livelihood. That's where we need to create alternative livelihoods for these kinds of farmers who are going to have to completely change their behavior patterns. And that requires a lot of focus on climate adaptive agriculture, sustainable agriculture that we talked about. That's going to change completely not only the knowledge transfer, but at the same time, working with the farmers around this area, good quality seeds and other things. And the third one is where you need to bring in the best of science, is around risk mitigation. How do you kind of bring in the best of data to forecast better so that it actually people in the community can plan better? Now, having said that, people will still move, people will still lose their lands, and that brings into the fourth pillar, that how do you create cities which actually are kind of more sustainable and also more adaptive to climate migrants. So essentially, I think what are the solutions you asked? I mean, these are, again, we have some ground examples and not very expensive solutions. And we need to really look at these as investments rather than grants. I mean, for example, it costs only $350 to provide safe drinking water to a household in Bangladesh by doing rainwater harvesting. Just about 8,000 is needed to have a climate resilient house that can work as a mini shelter during cyclones. And it costs about $126,000 to run a climate adaptation clinic that can work with 3,500 farmers to kind of work with them. Now, these solutions are not only cost effective, but they are low risk and offer huge returns. For every dollar invested in climate adaptation, investors could see about $2 to $10 net economic benefit. And if I just leave out the opportunity cost and other things, that's going to be even greater. So the question becomes that, I mean, this part, sort of the water solution that we talked about, and again, I'm very thankful that we partnered with the Danish government here. We came up with a solution that works in the household level, that works in the community level, and also creation of water entrepreneurs who are actually creating a livelihood also by selling water as well, so by reverse osmosis of salt water. Now, I kind of close, I mentioned the story of the farmer.
Yes.
Here's the good news, right? So the farmer who didn't see, wanted to make the son see a rice paddy field, he actually then ended up getting salt-tolerant seeds. And he said that everybody called me crazy, but I started doing rice cultivation in that land, which everybody thought rice cultivation is not possible. And so when I visited his paddy field, it was lush green, and he managed to make that happen. So this is the thing. I think the solutions are happening on the local level. They are there. So I think that needs to be kind of scaled up. And this is why we need adaptation financing at scale. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that. We appreciate it. And also ending it on an aspirational note, ending it on a positive note, showing that if we do the action, the results do speak for themselves. Thanks so much. I'm going to invite the Global Center on Adaptation. Why? Because you do facilitate collaboration and adaptation initiatives. We've heard from different speakers about the adaptation financing gap. We want to hear your experiences working particularly in Africa. What are these obstacles? Why is it that when we do have adaptation financing committed, that there are these gaps that still occur? And which solutions and initiatives do you think we should explore in that regard?
Thank you so very much. And let me start by numbers, because at the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, we, together with the Climate Policy Initiative, sat down and said, what is the adaptation finance gap in Africa? Okay. Well, it turns out that how much money is it going for Africa on adaptation a year today? $11 billion. And we went around, we look at every NDC. Half of the NDCs don't even have numbers, so you don't even know what is the need. But on average, it's about 56 billion that is needed a year. 11 coming, 56 billion. Right there, the need is tremendous. Even if you double adaptation finance and you reach 40 and all of it goes to Africa, it's not enough. Now, we went and unpacked a little bit because the NDCs, remember, are upstream documents, they are general strategic direction. We went a step down. We began to realize the climate information that was based for the NAPs is outdated. The impacts are much higher today. Second, once you go to the NDCs and you unpack, turns out that the needs are much higher, and we estimated it's about half the estimate of today. Actually, Africa may need twice that amount. 11 billion today per year, 100 billion are needed in Africa today. So these are numbers that actually show even further the urgency that doubling great target is not going to be enough. Now we unpack a little bit further. What financial instruments are being used on that funding? Well, it turns out that the majority of the funding are actually loans. The African governments are borrowing money to be able to invest in adaptation. It makes sense because it's that process, but the reality is that in transport, for example, action on adaptation in transport, 80% are loans. Even in agriculture, 50% are loans. And therefore, let's be also, when we talk about solidarity, the type of financing that is coming adaptation finance is important. And therefore, increasing the proportion of grants, particularly for certain areas, is critical. Third thing we found out, okay, so if you calculate to 2035, then Africa will need $1.7 trillion for adaptation. But we cannot see it in terms of costs. In our State and Trends in Adaptation flagship report that we prepare every year, we calculate what are the real actual benefits of every dollar invested in adaptation, 2 to 15 in Africa, on weighted average is 4. So if Africa does not invest $1.7 trillion between now and 2035, that is not the problem. The problem is that they are leaving on the table close to $6 trillion, $6 trillion of economic benefits, and Africa cannot afford to leave on the table those benefits. That is a tremendous loss in that process. Now, what we are setting up a very practical platform, because we also found that only the IFIs have a structured process of reporting on adaptation. Bilaterals have completely different methodologies. So as Mr. Chaudhry was saying, the reality is that you don't know what is real adaptation finance. Finance in Common last week in Colombia showed a number of what the national development banks are doing, but they don't have clear methodology. Most governments around the world don't have in the Ministry of Finance counting for adaptation. And in Africa, you know how much is the corporate, the real private sector investing in adaptation? 0.3%. 0.3% of the flows on adaptation are only coming from the corporate private sector. So what are we doing? Together with the African Development Bank and the African Union, we have launched the Africa Development Adaptation Program, the largest adaptation program in the world, $25 billion. So far in the first 2 years, we have been able to influence $6.7 billion for adaptation in Africa at a scale, working with the largest financiers and being very disciplined about what are the results of each of those dollars. Second, a big question is, sure, let's double an adaptation, but where is it gonna go? And therefore we are beginning to work with African ministries of finance to prepare adaptation compacts, where the African governments come and say, sure, we have the NDCs, they are upstream, their strategic directions, what are the specific programs and projects that we're ready to invest, let's put it on the table and let's do investment forums to mobilize. And the third thing we're doing is with the private sector, because it's good to say, yeah, we need the private sector, but the private sector, when they talk about climate financing, is all mitigation. They understand, okay, solar panels, renewable, electric buses, all that. But the reality is that when you talk to them on adaptation, they don't see a business opportunity. This afternoon, we are having the launch with the World Economic Forum of a global adaptation business hub that is very focused on showing that because adaptation has those benefits, there is a market potential in adaptation on the order of trillions of dollars. And our initial conversation with businesses is that they understand climate as a risk that they need to protect. They don't see it as a business investment opportunity in that process. So in the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, that is going to be an important area of engagement, and we appreciate the support from Denmark, the UK, the Netherlands, and many other countries that are really coming on that, because every dollar that is invested from these donor sources is actually influencing $100 of real adaptation investment on the ground. By COP, we'll have those numbers for the world, and turns out that we found that actually those numbers are not always credible. The latest numbers that are credible are only from 2019, 2020. So the numbers are late. There's not enough quality in the process. There is not consistency across, and we are gonna be launching the platform to be able to say, let's come together and let's get serious about transparently reporting on adaptation, because it's easy to say, let's double adaptation. If you don't know where are those numbers coming from, if you don't trust those numbers, not much to be done about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, the sobering perspective on what treasuries around the world are putting into adaptation financing, and also the, shall I call it, the anxiety or reticence of the private sector. So the scaling up has to happen on both sectors, public finance and private finance. Thank you so very much. Okay, so we do want to hear the ministerial interventions as well. We called this the high-level roundtable headway for adaptation. Let's then hear perspectives of governments. It's easy to be so dispirited when you hear the numbers, the statistics, and the gaps that exist. But do you have any solutions that can inspire us today to scale up adaptation finance? What best practices are you talking about in your governments, in your ministries, that you can put on the table? Shall I start with the representative from Netherlands first, Her Excellency Pascal Grottenhuis, the Vice Minister.
Thank you so much. I think much has been said about the adaptation financing gap, so I will leave that speaking point behind. I just want to add that the gap is widening, and that we feel that development partners, MDBs, donors, need to put adaptation at par with mitigation, and we need to collectively prioritize adaptation and really deliver on the commitments to double adaptation finance by 2025. We want to lead by example, and we will double our public adaptation finance contribution, and we are already spending more than 50% of our public climate finance on adaptation, with a focus on Africa and the LDCs. And I think, as you just very eloquently said, I think it's really important that it's grant-based, because there's a particular need to support adaptation investments with grant funding, especially in the LDCs in Africa. I also really want to confirm that public resources will only get us that far. I think the Danish Undersecretary, and I think we're very aligned in the way we operate, we need everyone on board and join forces. So it's about joining forces with governments, multilateral institutions, development banks, and the private sector. Collaboration is key, but it's also really urgent. And I think it's good to give some concrete examples on how we try to accelerate. So we feel that multilateral institutions have to lead the way for the private sector, for example, by sharing the GEMS database about the risk of investing in emerging markets and developing countries, as the perceived risk by private sector is a barrier for them to invest. We also feel that development banks should catalyze institutional capital, such as pension funds, as is being done in the Netherlands, by allowing them to participate in their investments. And I hope you all know ILX is doing pioneering work on this frontier and proves that innovations can be scaled up without blended finance. Thirdly, within the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, financial partners FMO and climate fund managers have teamed up with development organizations SNV and the World Wildlife Fund. And together they are mobilizing private finance for a host of local projects all around over the world. So I think we have some very concrete examples about scaling up, finding new money. And if you want to know more, please reach out to me. And then it's not only about the money. It's a lot about the money, but it's not only about the money. It's also about accessibility and the quality of the finance provided, because very little finance reaches the local level and also reaches the poorest of the poorest and the most vulnerable people. So we need more climate finance for locally led adaptation to support design, implementation, monitoring, and sustaining of adaptation actions on the front lines. The agenda is really important to ensure long-term developmental impact, generation solutions that are effective and locally owned and implemented. Higher quality adaptation finance also means more decentralized, transparent, patient, and predictable finance, while addressing access and eligibility barriers, including the international climate funds, such as the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility. So the Netherlands remains very much committed to enable and promote initiatives and solutions that close the adaptation finance gap in order to respond to the growing needs, while ensuring balance with mitigation finance and making sure they are targeted to reach those most in need and do it together with other partners. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. Okay. I think I heard you talk about more money, more finance, and people must talk to you afterwards. I think that's bold. We'll take you up on that. But again, you're speaking to a theme that you've raised about the quality of the finance. So there'll be an announcement made with much fanfare, but when you look at the structure of the financing and the loans and how that can be an albatross around any nation, especially a poor nation's neck. Thank you so very much for that. Let us then hear from the representative, Excellency Twele Sulu Cedric Schuster. I just couldn't resist saying it. Again, about examples that can inspire us, solutions that you are thinking about that you can put on the table today.
Thank you. Thanks for great pronunciation is the right pronunciation as well. For future, just call me Cedric or Schuster to make it easier. I think I'll pick up on the point of accessibility. For us, that's the biggest issue. I've heard commitments for the last 30 years of how much billions and billions and billions, countries, donors. We haven't seen any of that. And I take this from Samoa's standpoint. When we developed our National Adaptation Plan, Action Plan in 2005, only 2 of those projects that we identified, which are priorities back then, have been partially implemented. We redeveloped it in 2011. None of it has been implemented. We've developed at the national level, and we've gone to develop community integrated plans, which includes adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And another important part for us, as we're living it on a daily basis. If it's either slow onset, losing the coastal, we have the flooding, We have droughts on a daily basis. So it's not a seasonal event. And we've been saying it from the region and since day one of the UNFCCC. And that's why we've always hammered that this is adaptation has always been important because it's the only thing that we could do at the moment. So access is really important for us. We can say, as everyone says, we need to double the financing. Yes, we'll get behind that, double the finance, but more access, more importantly, that fund needs to help us implement the plans that we already have. That's the plan. That even if it's small amount, but if we can get access to that, not the 10 years to develop a proposal for GCF, not the 5 years to develop a proposal for GEF, and by the time it actually gets implemented, gets the funding, 40% of it goes to administration, and actually 10% gets to the actual community that is affected, but it also, you spent more on administration. So that the accessibility, but also the structures, so that the funds are actually ending up more at those affected communities. And as such, for us, doubling, increasing the funding for the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, but also with the bilaterals are important. And the focus on programmatic approach, not the 1-2 year project specific. We develop our plans. Please, when you want to support, come look at our plans and help us implement. Not come with your own plans and say, okay, we want you to spend the next 5 years developing this plan because this is what our window asks us. And when we finish planning according to your plan, you say, sorry, we don't have any funds to implement it. So these are the realities that we have to live with. We've got plans coming out of our ears, filling our shelves, but none of it getting implemented. So walk the talk, please. The other issue I also, the important is looking at, especially when it comes to the GEF and GCF, is getting beyond the incremental funding. The programmatic approach for us is important. In terms of new ideas, a lot of our small and developing states have limited human resources. And so if we're looking at partnerships, working with the private sector, some of the technology that's available out there, we're not aware of. Until we turn up to meetings like this, then we hear the presentation of this great technology that's out there. We don't actually know about it back home. We don't know how to connect to that technology and be able to utilize it. It might be working great in Africa or other parts of the world, but because we have, some of our countries have 2 or 3 people working environment conservation, climate change, energy, renewable energy, all 5, 6 different hats, they aren't able to do that. So having at some extent, having bodies to help out with some of the work will be a great opportunity that we can start exploring, and great to hear a lot of the technology, the expertise that's out there. So that's why I was patting Netherlands. Also, in terms of supporting SOF, the systematic observation financial facility, that seems to have it helps us in terms of linking the work that we're doing. But also one of the other area that we've promoted and tried to develop for the Pacific and a lot of the SIDS is the MVI, because it highlights a lot of the adaptation impacts. So utilizing some of that, and it's more geared to our specific needs and the impact that we're having. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I saw Mr. Graham Stewart nodding quite vigorously when you were talking about that kind of incompatible approach, that you would have your systems and your plans that are not unique necessarily, but that are well crafted and relevant to your realities on the ground. But from a financing point of view, there's almost an expectation that you must design it this way. If you don't, then suddenly there isn't financing. I think that was a very important message to put on the table. Thank you very much. Let's hear then from the UK your suggestions, solutions, and initiatives so that we can close the adaptation finance gap.
Well, thank you very much. And we've had really thoughtful, I think, great presentations from everyone who's spoken. But I probably nodded most savagely for Cedric, just getting to that reality on the ground of this, all this goodwill and all this money, this alphabet soup of organizations and initiatives. And Cedric sits there and all this talk about empowerment and listening to the people on the ground and respecting their knowledge. And then Cedric tells us what happens in Samoa. And that's, kind of very sobering point. We've got, everyone always agrees with each other on these panels, and if you keep going to them as well, you think, well, how the heck can the world be so far off where it's supposed to be when they all agree? So let me I'll try and be controversial. Who do I not agree with? Let me pick on a couple of people. Well, we've got talking about, we get these returns, so it's investable. Well, if the tiny amounts of private finance are going in, it clearly isn't investable in any normal conventional sense. So that's, and we're talking about we need more grant funding. Well, you can get ourselves into that battle. So we do need more grant funding. We need more funding. But it's never, doesn't matter what happens, if we smash open the donor base, which we need to, by the way, and 30-year-old definition is no way to be going forward. And so, as someone who's only been responsible, I become the UK chief negotiator on COP a year ago, day after Sharm. I kind of been around as a backbench member of parliament before that, always with my nose to the glass. Everyone seemed to be getting in there ahead of a legislator like me. But anyway, now I find myself in government. And everyone's in trenches, aren't they? Everyone's just fighting on exactly the same ground they were 5 years, 10 years ago. So we need to break out of all that. But one of these is around the grant bit. And let's be realistic about that. And no matter how, if we smash that open and we get all sorts of other donors to come in, you're still not going to have a fraction. You've heard the numbers. So we need more there. But we've got to make it genuinely investable. And genuinely investable things typically do happen because people make money from it and they keep investing. And declaring something's investable when no money flows is clearly nonsense. So we've got to do more in that space to make it practical. And that means there's, a more honest conversation with the countries concerned. Without good governance, without rule of law, without other things, practically nothing's investable. So there's a whole honest conversation. It's just shouting at the rich world to give more and us going, oh yeah, we are, and we're doing a bit more than they are, and I can tell you about what I'm doing in the UK, and we're really noble. It doesn't get us anywhere. We've really got to try and cut out of this. But anyway, so, those are just my opening reflections. And a further one, because I just love Cedric every time I see him, is the practical stuff again. We're negotiating, we're going to continue to negotiate, but COPs have got to move on as well, haven't they? It's about implementation now, as everyone again says. And I'm really pleased that this year's COPs agreed to have a Parliamentarians' Day. Who sets the regulations? Who drives the systems? National legislators. And if they had all the years I had been kept outside, it's kind of nonsense. So we need to bring them in more. We need to bring the solution providers more. We need to use this vast, expensive carbon emitting event into the most practical possible way to allow people like Cedric all over the world to get the best technology. We're pulling it together and be practical. Anyway, that's enough from me there on all of that. The need to scale up adaptation finance is clear. I won't repeat that again. Obviously, it was, I think, 2020, only 29% of global finance, climate finance towards the 100 billion goal was on adaptation. But it's also been said, it's not only the quantum, and the quantum is important, but the quality, which is key. And again, as came out from what Cedric was saying and others, barriers remain to accessing quality finance at speed and scale to support the delivery of climate action. And just in terms of what we're doing, try to be practical. The UK, which I think in this case means me, is co-chairing the third session of the Climate and Development Ministerial with the UAE Presidency, Malawi and Vanuatu at pre-COP, the pre-COP event, which will focus on access and delivery of adaptation finance, hopefully to address the points that Cedric so made so well. So far, some of the potential solutions identified through the Climate and Development Ministerial, including harmonizing processes to access funds, because they are phenomenally complex, and that's going to help, improving the predictability of adaptation finance, and further integration of climate and development finance together. And the task force on access to climate finance, another one of the alphabet soup with which we sail, co-chaired by UK and Rwanda, was established as an outcome of that first Climate and Development Ministerial, directly to address specific concerns related to the access to finance. And I'd urge all climate finance providers and recipients to apply that task force's principles and recommendations. At COP28, the UK will launch a new global centre, just to add to the alphabet soup, but a new global centre for the task force on access to climate finance, basically a capability centre. This aims to be an independent voice capable of bringing together and amplifying ideas on climate finance reform. It'll inform action and push global climate finance providers to improve so that climate finance flows are faster and more effective. Finally, we know that total adaptation needs can't be addressed, as I've already touched on, through public finance alone. On private finance, we know that companies are starting to put climate resilience within their supply chains and operations, but I know working with John Kerry on things like forestry, it's a bit slower than we would like, and we've got to keep the pressure up on those major players. But when we view climate adaptation in a development context, the private finance for specific adaptation projects, it turns out, is minimal. There are many opportunities that we can collectively support to scale that work up, for instance, through the country platforms, the GCF, and we're pleased to have recently announced our $2 billion increased contribution to that, and its private sector strategy and other key initiatives like the UK-supported Private Infrastructure Development Group. And Mafalda Duarte, who's the excellent new head of GCF, I mean, we're absolutely backing her, I know with other colleagues, to get the system to change. So Cedric, you know, we don't find ourselves after all these warm words with Cedric or his successor in 4 years' time giving exactly the same speech, because they did 4 years ago and 4 years before that, didn't they? So let's touch briefly on what outcomes we need at COP28. I think the answer is twofold and clear. We need to provide reassurance that our commitments will be met, and we need focus on solutions to be able to scale up support for adaptation at the scale needed. I want to reiterate our pledge to support the most vulnerable who are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change by tripling our funding on adaptation from 500 million in 2019 to 1.5 billion in 2025, as we announced at COP, and acknowledging that we can do more collectively as donors to provide assurance that we will actually deliver. And we're keen to listen to others who have ideas on the ways that we can provide that reassurance and make that flow, but also keep our eyes on the prize, which is we've got to bring in so much more than we can ever give. And so let's focus on that too. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And that takes us nicely to our next theme then. We have a second panel discussion, and this time around we are focusing on COP28 and what outcomes we need there. I want to thank you for a new word that I've learned. What did you call it? An alphabet soup. I love it. Thank you very much. Let me call then the panelists for the next panel discussion, looking at what outcomes do we need for COP28. I do know that some of you do have to leave, so with that in mind, please let's keep our interventions and our responses short so that we can wrap this up. And there are also some of you who are scheduled to do one-on-one interviews hereafter. So to the next panelists, I do apologize. We've run out of time, and I'd like you to be brief, please. Let me welcome from the Maldives, Excellency Khadija Nassim, Minister of State. Please take a seat wherever you wish to sit. And from Ghana, Dr. Kwaku Afriye, Minister of Environment. Welcome to you, Minister. From the USA, Christina Chan, Senior Adaptation Advisor, US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, US Department of State. Welcome. And the EU Deputy Head of Delegation, Dimitrios Zevgolis. Thank you so much. Excellency Saima Wazid Hussein, ZVF Ambassador for Vulnerability. And of course, ZVF is Climate Vulnerable Forum, a network gathering around 50 vulnerable countries. Very important voice. And IFRC, Jagan Chapagan, Secretary General, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Thank you so much. Okay, let's start. I will start with you, representative from Ghana. Dr. Kwaku Afriye, Minister of Environment. We've got COP28 coming in a couple of weeks. We've had COP27, COP26, all the COPs that we've had over the last couple of years. What must we expect there? What do we need to see? What are your hopes for the outcome of that gathering?
Well, thank you very much. I must make a few corrections here. My minister is up there with another program. I'm Henry Kwabena Kokofu, the Executive Director for Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana, and then the Presidential Special Envoy for CVF. So I'm standing in for the minister.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Well, we in Ghana are doing things in collaboration with the CVF, and then also looking up to COP28 with high hopes of getting the adaptation financing doubled, as we've always been talking about. We think that turning to concrete initiatives beyond the UNFCCC process and coming from Africa, we would like to highlight the African Leaders Communique, which was adopted earlier this month during the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, to guide a resilient transformation for Africa in light of the climate emergency fallout in the region. Africa was recognized by the IPCC as the continent most vulnerable to the impact of climate change, and therefore accelerating adaptation action at speed and at scale is the continent's #1 priority. But this will require international financial support. Overall, Africa requires at least $56 billion annually for adaptation by 2030, and may need as much as $100 billion per year, making it the highest adaptation financing needs of any region. However, this is expected to be an underestimation, and Africa may require as much as 1.7 billion US for climate adaptation by 2030. Together with our colleagues, we have committed through the African Leaders Communique to turbocharging the flagship Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAP, a joint initiative with the Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank. The AAP has already mainstreamed adaptation solutions into over $5.4 billion US of investments in Africa. Ghana, as CVF chair, hopes to see similar ambitions programs established in all vulnerable developing countries or regions. Additionally, the DCA and ADB have recently launched the AAP Country Compacts, which aim to scale up adaptation finance on the African continent. These compacts serve as country-led investment roadmaps, outlining adaptation, investment priorities, financing needs, and strategies for mobilizing finance to implement climate adaptation measures. While 7 compasses have already been launched, Ghana aspires to witness the emergence of more such initiatives to other regions across the world. In conclusion, the climate adaptation finance gap is a pressing global challenge, and it is our collective responsibility to address it. Ghana, as CVF chair, is committed to advocating for equitable and transparent solutions, urging developed nations to fulfill their obligations, and supporting innovative programs like the AAP. Together, we can make significant progress in closing the adaptation finance gap and ensuring a more resilient future for all. We will be going to COP28 with a common voice as Africa and vulnerable countries, calling on colleagues at the global north to fulfill the pledges of finance and climate. Soon, world is beginning to forget about the $100 billion pledge. we need to remind ourselves that the time is now to save the world and save these people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. And I do want to challenge the rest of the panelists. You spoke for under 4 minutes. That's just excellent. So there we go. Thank you very much. Let's hear then from Excellency Khadija Nasim, Minister of State for the Maldives, COP28.
Thank you so much. And first of all, good morning, everybody. And thank you, Denmark. Thank you, Bangladesh, for bringing us all together to discuss these important topics. I'm from the Maldives, one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And of course, we're facing the slow onset impacts of climate, like the colleague from Bangladesh mentioned. These things are happening slowly, but it's surely having an impact. So every year we're seeing more coastal inundation, the swellings, the storms. When it comes, it's more intense and it happens more frequently. So in the Maldives, we are already facing the climate impacts, and of course, it's also not just it's now going to the point where adaptation is also turning into having to address losses and damages as well. So there is this gradual deterioration of our lives in the Maldives and how well we are able to live. So first of all, I want to highlight, the transboundary nature of climate impacts and why it's so important for countries like the Maldives, Bangladesh, and countries like Denmark and Netherlands, and all our international partners to work together, because climate change is impacting everybody. What happens in Norway and what happens in Maldives are only different because Norway would have different capacities in technology, resources, access to finance, and know-how, and it's vastly different in a small island state like the Maldives. So it's not only about finance, but it's also elevating our knowledge, our access to these other means of implementation that will help us to do our development and our sustainable development in a more transformative and in a more resilient way. So when climate impacts happen, we're already in the 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius. The 1.5 is expected to happen in 2030, which is not very far. It's only some 70-some months away. And also the WMO recently said it could actually surpass in 2027. So for low-lying island nations like Samoa, like the Maldives, it's really an existential threat. And so what does COP have to do with all of this? So we have been discussing for 28 COPs, almost. It's coming. And the reason why it's important is because this is the only multilateral space where the world comes together to address on important matters of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And unfortunately, because we were not able to mitigate, because we were not able to do adaptation, now we have already crossed into the loss and damage space as well, which is unfortunate. But if the world collectively comes together, and if we can close the work program on the global goal and adaptation, which sets the framework, because the UNFCCC has the global icon for mitigation, which is the 1.5. For finance, there's a goal, even though it's not achieved, but it looks like it's going to be achieved this year, the 100 billion a year. For the global goal on adaptation, we don't have this icon, and we also need to agree on it. And so this is important, so countries can start with their, it's already ongoing, it's not reinventing the wheel, but we need to agree on the framework of adaptation. And as previous speakers has mentioned, it's important to have these frameworks and plans in place so that we know what we are asking for in terms of finance and what countries like us want to do. And actually, small island states, we would still like to survive and thrive in a climate uncertain future. But for us to be able to do that, we need to have the access to the things I mentioned before. And there could be lots of innovative ways of doing that. So it's not only public finance. We have to think of partnerships with the private sector, with the philanthropies, with all other things that exist out there. So we have to be very creative, because if we aren't creative in the current landscape, it's borderline impossible. But what's hopeful is that there is a lot of money in this world. There's a lot of talent that's been proved during COVID as well. Like, if you put the best minds together, you can come with solutions. So there is the resources, there is the technology, there are the minds. So you have to help elevate people in the most vulnerable countries to rise up and do their sustainable development in a transformative way, where we're able to address the underlying risks climate imposes on biodiversity, health, water, food security, critical infrastructure, all of these things that would help us actually be resilient. And that is of paramount importance, both for donors and for countries like us, because if we do that, then the costs that we have to deal with in the future would be much, much less. So for COP, I really expect the global goal on adaptation to close. I also hope that, the ongoing initiatives like the early warning for all systems and others help gain more prominence, because these are things that could help countries like us address not only adaptation, but also loss and damage as well. So I have expectations for the COP there in the sense that we really see this as a point where we keep the 1.5 degree alive. We close on the work program and global goal and adaptation. We do get the loss and damage fund and funding arrangements closed. And so I remain hopeful, because we have to remain hopeful in this crisis. This is the only way that you can come up with solutions, because we would love to live in the Maldives and stay there and live well. So thank you.
Thank you so very much, Your Excellency. Thank you. Let's hear from the United States, Christina Chan.
Thank you so much, and I'll try to stay under 4 minutes. I wanted to thank the governments of Denmark and Bangladesh for hosting this really important event, and I want to speak to this question of COP28 and what we need to do. But I first want to just mark that this UNGA marks the second year anniversary of when the President Biden announced his commitment to increase our adaptation finance 6 times from the highest levels during the Obama administration. And he announced, following UNGA of that year in Glasgow, his emergency plan for adaptation and resilience Prepare. And I wanted to speak a little bit to why the president launched Prepare, because I think it does speak to what we need out of COP28 this year. And the reason we launched, and the president launched Prepare, and why we worked, Secretary Kerry's office and USAID worked with him to do this, is because we felt like there was so much excellent work happening on adaptation, including from the US government and the various agencies that touch on support internationally for adaptation. But it was very thousand flowers blooming. And if we really were going to make a mark with this commitment for $3 billion a year by 2024 for adaptation assistance, we wanted to have a whole of government North Star based on the points raised earlier during the opening remarks were about science and following science. So absolutely important to follow science, and Prepare is rooted in that, but it's also rooted in practice. The IPCC, absolutely critical, but the experiences, for example, that have been shared by Samoa, by BRAC, in Ghana, in the Maldives, this is like practitioners, right? And we need to value what they are saying. So we wanted to give ourselves a North Star so that we are all rowing in the same direction, even as we're leveraging each agency's strengths and our comparative advantages and our niches. And what we landed on based on the science, but also on practice, is 3 areas where there are gaps that we felt the US government and the 19 agencies that touch on international support could help address. And those 3 areas, the first is early warning and climate information services. We need better data. But it's not just better data. It's not just our support to the WMO's Systematic Observations Finance Facility. Observations are like systematic ops, absolutely critical. The SOF allows us to put our money in and be efficient in terms of how that is deployed, in terms of filling gaps. But there's also the user end, right? And what we've learned in the last 20 years or so when it comes to climate information is if we continue to invest in the science and just the science and the production end without thinking about the user end, we're going to continue to produce information that's not used. And so I just wanted to emphasize that it's not just about a focus on let's make sure we close the gap on early warning, but how we do it is so critical. And that's where the practice and the lessons learned come in. The second area is integration into some key sectors, and that's health, water, infrastructure, and food security, and an emphasis on locally led adaptation. It's great to see the leadership from Senegal, for example, from the LDCs with respect to how the LDCs are championing locally led adaptation, and the US is very pleased to be supportive of that effort. And then, of course, there's innovation and private sector. It's private sector capital mobilization, but it's also engagement and innovation. And we launched last year a call to action to the private sector. I raise all this because we're also this year not struggling, but trying to figure out how do we measure and evaluate and learn from our investments. I don't think it's just if you put money into it, it does good.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that what we're doing is actually leading. We need to understand what works, what doesn't, and to be okay with failure and testing and seeing what fails and why so we can do better. I say all of that because that is the conversation happening right now on the global goal on adaptation and the framework that we're establishing. All of us working in the adaptation community are looking for that North Star to elevate adaptation globally, but also that North Star to galvanize all of the wonderful initiatives that everyone has talked about so that we can go further and faster. And I think that is what we need out of the GGA framework this year. It's a framework that gives those signals, that North Star for all of us to be collectively going in the same direction, even as we recognize that adaptation is locally led, it's country driven. The other piece of this is the assessment of progress. So we see one of the outputs of the GGA framework is the ability to help countries with indicators, right, that are fit for purpose, nationally determined, but be able to share those best practices. It's not just best practices on technology, but how do we measure progress nationally and subnationally, and then at the global level. We think that there's a role for the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement to also at the global level we can use the Adaptation Committee to be looking at all of the reports that come in from national adaptation plans to NDCs to BTRs to give input to the GST on that. And finally, in terms of the finance negotiations, we are very much looking forward to the report of the Standing Committee on Finance, on how we're doing on the doubling of adaptation finance as well. And along with the OECD report on adaptation finance, I think that will help us understand what we need to be doing to further scale up. And a final point is on the Paris alignment and 2.1C. A lot of that has been focused on mitigation. And while I fully agree with the points made about dedicated adaptation finance as a way to really catalyze change when it comes to climate resilience, we actually really do need to be mainstreaming adaptation across everything we do. So those would be my thoughts on COP28. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Let's hear then from Dimitrios Zevgolis, Deputy Head of Delegation EU.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Denmark and Bangladesh for organizing this event. We are really grateful for being invited and having the chance to provide our views on this topic. We have heard a lot of good points, so I risk to repeat quite a few of them, but please bear with me. I'll be brief. Let me give you a bit of a perspective from the side of the European Union. At first, when it comes to finance, for us, it was never a question whether we need to have balance between adaptation finance and mitigation finance. It was, I would say that at least when it comes to our own financing, our development financing and how it is directed to mitigation and adaptation action, we always saw that adaptation finance was being required much more by our partner countries, and that's where our projects are focusing on in the recent years. Also because when it comes to mitigation, there is already the private sector that takes a lot of this burden, and our grant financing is not anymore so much requested when it comes to hard investment, but rather is focusing on soft investment. But in the case of the adaptation, it's a different story. There we need to provide much more support when it comes to making infrastructure resilient, and that's where we are now. We are providing over 20 billion. I think in 2021 it was 23 billion euros for climate finance, and almost half of it, and I would say even more than half of it, it has been directed to adaptation action. And soon we're going to have the figures for the year 2022, and I count that we will be in a better place. Now we are in a process that we are reviewing we are looking at where we stand with our development cooperation, and we will learn lessons. We are in the midpoint because we work with 7-year cycles, so from 2021 to 27. So now we're going to see what we need to fix in this process. And that brings me to the lessons that we learned from the climate negotiations. There is a lot that we get from these discussions for the global goal on adaptation and from the global stocktake. And I think that already we have a lot of good material out there, even without the COP decisions that document the output of a COP. Already from the work that we are doing in order to reach to these decisions, we have a lot of material that all the countries need to take into account. So let's start with the global stocktake. We have the technical phase synthesis report. And there we have very particular findings that have to do with adaptation that we need to take into account in our further discussions. So the first finding, that we need a step change. I think everyone realizes that. But it says something else as well. We need to ensure that we have responsibility at all levels of governments and from all the governments. And already there we see that it is not just about the representation of the party, it's not about the executive of the government, but actually we need to work with all the local actors inside the countries. And that brings us to the transformative adaptation, another finding. The transformative adaptation needs to be informed in a bottom-up manner in each country. So when the countries are doing their national planning, they need to put in place all this machinery to bring this planning to all places in the country. It cannot be something that is being done in a remote room with a few consultants that sometimes are being paid by international aid, and they are doing some desk work, and they produce all this documentation that just sits on the shelf. I mean, we heard earlier from Samoa that it takes a lot of time, you produce something, and then it's not being used. We need ownership, and that ownership needs to be embraced and it needs to be nurtured by the governments.
Mm-hmm.
We need increased ambition. We see that we have increased ambition already. We have a lot of adaptation communications, we have NAPs that have been submitted, and all the reports are showing that the ambition of this adaptation cycle has increased. Nevertheless, still we have fragmentation, still we have incrementality. A lot of this stuff is focusing in particular sectors and not in the whole economy. And there is an equal distribution. Even inside the country, there is an equal distribution between regions. So all these elements need to be addressed. Finally, loss and damage, we need to prove to more funding. I think that it becomes very clear, and we have particular topic on that. And we need to see the interplay between climate and other policies, development policies. I will resist the notion of trying to put particular labels to what is adaptation finance, what is mitigation finance, what is development finance, and all that. All these labels might support an exercise when it comes to reporting, but the truth is that there is such an interplay between all these kind of policies that we cannot see something clearly as an adaptation policy and separately to a health policy, for example. So in all those elements, we expect that we're going to get some good results at the COP. the global stocktake output needs to recognize these elements and provide us guidance. And then I think we heard from other speakers about the global goal adaptation discussion, the framework that will come there. We expect that the policy cycle will be addressed there, that we're going to have all 4 steps of the policy cycle being recognized and with particular guidance when it comes to them, when it comes to climate risk assessment and the early warning systems for all, the quality of planning, how we can have more synergies there with national processes, international processes, how we build our implementation plan, and then how we learn from implementation. Very important element, because a lot of this time, what I have seen in my experience all these 25 years that I'm in this field is that we build new plans, adaptation plans, mitigation plans. Every few years when there is some financing, a country will build a national adaptation plan. Is there a feedback loop? Is there a process to learn from what we achieved with the previous plan? We need that to be clear to our minds. So I will stop there. I think that we're working to the right direction, and let's not forget, there are also a lot of other processes out there that are working to the same direction. We see the work in the Biodiversity Convention, the work in under the Sendai framework. We need to bring all these processes together also and learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let's get the views then of Your Excellency Saima Wasid Hussein. I must just say that the conclusions from this room will be shared with COP28 presidency, so it's very, very important. So the question again about COP28, what would you like to tell them in relation to adaptation finance?
Good morning, everyone. It's really such a pleasure to be here today, and you know, it's such a perfect segue for me, because as we've heard His Excellency from Samoa, as we've heard from Maldives and what you mentioned, my role really is talking about the people, because as we talk about the policies, we're talking about financing, nobody's actually mentioning what is happening to our communities, to the individuals, you know, how climate change and the lack of financing or the lack of having progressive programs, the lack of implementation of many of our promises that we keep making is affecting us, our people. You know, especially the vulnerable people, how it is affecting their physical health, how it's affecting their mental health, how it's, you know, with climate change, food production, agriculture is being destroyed. Countries that knew when to harvest, when to grow their crops, aren't getting the rains at the right time. It's destroying their ability to feed the people. It's making places less secure. Communities are getting flooded and destroyed, and we have refugee crisis within countries because they're having to leave their profession, they're having to leave their livelihood and move somewhere else and reinvent themselves. So, you know, one of the things that was mentioned is looking at local solutions. Mm-hmm. People from my country in Bangladesh are extremely resilient. We're used to a lot of natural disasters. We're used to dealing with things. So let's also look at what local solutions that are there, that are working. Let's finance those. Let's research and monitor and see what is effective, and take the opportunity to invest in things that work for our people, our communities, that ensure that they're much more resilient, and then use those ideas perhaps in other countries and other communities that perhaps don't have the same plans but have similar problems. So let's learn from one another and not forget, in all of this conversation, not forget the people, not forget the most vulnerable people, because at the end of the day, it is the people that are impacted. And as we keep talking about policies, we cannot forget who we really talk about. Mm-hmm. It's not countries, it's not borders. We're all being affected, you know. And I think, you know, COVID-19 showed us that, right? We closed our borders thinking we might be safer. We did so many things because some countries have more resources, other countries don't. But who were impacted? We were all impacted. You know, the global financial crisis affects all of us. We have political borders, but when we're faced with, you know, global crises like a pandemic, like climate change, that we're not addressing the needs of the people, we will get impacted regardless of where we have resources. So I think in the finance discussion for the next COP28, we have to really bring the focus down to the people who need it the most. It's the people, the vulnerable people, our communities. And I'd just like to end with, thanking Bangladesh and Denmark for organizing this, particularly in line of, UNGA, where so much of our focus is on health, because climate change is having a significant impact on health, both physical health and mental health. And ultimately, we're sort of staring in the face of impending doom that we're kind of not talking about in this climate change conversation. So we need to realize that and mitigate and put our money where
our mouth
is. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So, the International Federation of the Red Cross, I wanted to end with you because you're the people we all run to when we are facing these disasters. You are the people who have to deal with our physical, mental, and spiritual uprooting that come from these disasters. Talk to me then about the next couple of weeks. What would you like COP28 to consider as we make this journey to adaptation finance?
Thank you, and thank you for the kind words. I think you kept the best for the last, so thank you. No, first of all, thank you so much, Denmark, Bangladesh, for organizing this and inviting us. Maybe 3 or 4 things. I don't want to get into a lot of the policy inputs because they have already been made, so I don't want to repeat those things. Maybe focus on just 3 or 4 points I want to share with you. The first thing, what I really hope COP28 would be, that the leaders will come to listen, not only to talk. I really find, even here, let's see, the first 3 rows are empty. Generally, the people who need to take decision don't come to listen what people have to say, what communities have to say. I think you talk very passionately about that. We come to tell the solution. We don't want to listen the ideas. I think, Christina, you talked about science is important, but the lived experience from the communities, from the people, are equally important, if not more important. So, and this is something with Adnan we have been talking very, very strongly, that let's come to listen. That's really very important part, because if you don't listen, you don't learn. If you don't learn, you don't lead. And that's why listening becomes extremely, extremely important. So that's the first point I wanted to share with you. The second thing, and I think it's mentioned a number of times, but I want to repeat because it's so important. When we were discussing the COP28 in the beginning, and one of the conversations we had, and one of the inputs I shared with them was, we got to make COP about people, as you talked so passionately about. So people means the issues, frankly, 1.5 degrees, who cares on the communities? I was in Egypt-Sudan border, it's 48 degrees. It becomes 49.5, doesn't matter. So our message is not connecting with the people because the language we are talking just doesn't resonate at the community level. So we need to change that to the issues of the community. That's water, that's food, that's health. If we can make the connection of the climate impact on day-to-day lives of the people, then we generate that groundswell of support from the communities. The policy makers gets pressure to bring about the change. We are trying to bring about the change from New York and Geneva. Frankly, change doesn't come, and it hasn't come after 28 COPs. So let's get that groundswell of support from bottom up. So that's really so make it people's COP. Focus on water, food, health. Of course, here we are talking about financing, and I want to say a couple of ideas. Luckily, UK Minister is not here because I was going to pick on him.
We'll send the message.
Yeah. He talked about alphabet soup, and then later on, he added so many alphabet soups of initiative, including a suggestion that they want to create a center to find out that where the money should go. Honestly, we don't need another center to tell us. We know where the money needs to go. Just listen to a few people. I mean, the answers are already there. I have heard the GCA being a bit of a punching bag, a bit of a popular punching bag lately. I mean, you governments, most of the governments, sit on the board of the GCF, demand a change in 6 months. We know GCF is complicated, bureaucratic. It takes 3 years, 4 years to get the funding. And the community-based organization cannot access the funding because it's so bloody complicated. And the demands are so much, as some of our ministers said, 40% of the money goes on meeting the bureaucratic needs. But you are sitting in the board. Why don't you demand the change and fix the damn thing in 6 months? It is fixable. So let's stop punching GCF. Let's just demand the change. It can be done if we are serious about it. So that's the type of message I think the COP28 needs to do. One other thing I also want to add here is, I know there is a lot of discussion around the volume of financing for adaptation, and I 100% agree. I think the funding available is not enough. But what is also equally important is the flow of funding. And I think a number of you mentioned, the funding simply doesn't reach the communities. Mm-hmm. It has a habit of disappearing somewhere. And I have to figure out, and I don't know where it goes, all these billions announced, and I think some more ministers said, and I am a very community-based organization, 200,000 local branches we visit all of them. None of this money has reached the real communities. Maybe bits and pieces here and there. Mm-hmm. Bits and pieces here and there. It doesn't reach. So let's not only focus on volume, let's focus on why this money available is not reaching the community level. Again, it should not be a rocket science to fix that. Let me just give you a couple of examples what we are doing in my organization. So we have a couple of initiatives. One is WORLD, what is called Disaster Response Emergency Fund. 86% of the funding, it goes directly to the community action, 86%. The grand bargain target was 25%. Organizations have not even reached 3 to 5%. And we have been able to get 86% of the funding directly to the community level for the last many, many years. And just this year, we also introduced insurance window that Disaster Response Emergency Fund tried to get this innovative financing. As many of said, the grant is not going to be enough. That much money doesn't exist. So we have to be innovative. So 20% of our Disaster Response Emergency Fund now we are getting through insurance mechanism. So we are actually transferring the risk to the insurance company. So if any of the donor, you have money, if you put it in the draft, I will double the money, not double, I will increase the money 4 times. You give me 5 million, I will make it 20 million. That's the type of innovative mechanism we need to put in place. And we just started, we just launched it this year. So I'm doing a bit of my propaganda here. The second initiative we just started is what we call global climate resilience platform. So learning from this DREF experience, we also have created this platform where the climate resilience funding can actually go direct to the communities again without this multiple layers, every layer taking 7 to 10%. And by the time it reaches, half the money has basically gone on the administrative cost. And this is just the reality. And we all know, but we continue to do that. So can we change that? And actually, we have some of the solutions. And okay, I'm giving example of my organizations. BRAC, you have brilliant examples. And there are so many such examples that exist. Why don't we just invest on them so that we can make sure that your money goes to the communities, and we can assure you that we can make that happen. So finally, the COP28, and this is something we have been discussing also with the organizers, that can we make COP28 the COP of hope? I think we talk this really hyperbolic language that, oh, everything is so bad. And, frankly, I mean, you introduced this, but heating to boiling, I mean, what the hell we are saying here?
It's reality.
I mean, the reality is there. So we don't need to use such language if we just have a sober conversation. We don't need to use such language to make sure that this is a serious issue. By using such language, we are creating this a hyperbolic situation, and our youth commission actually did a study, and what they found was one of the major cause of mental health issue on the young population has been the language used in climate discussion. Because what the message we are sending is, in 10 years, the world is collapsing. And if I'm a 16-year-old man, I have 2 boys, why bother? In 10 years, the world is finishing anyway. Mm-hmm. What are we doing as leaders? Irresponsible, in my view. Of course, we don't underestimate the seriousness of the climate crisis, and we can do this without making those hyperbolic statements. It is serious. There is evidence. There is impact on people. Let's have sober conversation. But let's also continue to send the message to the young people that there is a hope. If we work together collectively, we can address this. We address COVID-19, we can address climate change also. So let's send that message of hope and not all the time message of despair without undermining, of course, the seriousness of the crisis. Thank you.
Okay, so a healthy symbiotic relationship between the science and the data, which is what the numbers are saying, but also the human connection. We shouldn't be alarmist, but should be aspirational, as we heard, so that we can explore solutions. Okay, I've got 2 little daughters. They are 9 and 7. I'm going to tone it down a notch and speak hope, but also action. We need that money. We need to close the gap. And we take the challenges, we take the vision that has been articulated to COP28, and we remind ourselves of the need for action. I thank you so very much, my esteemed panelists, for sharing your perspectives, your case studies, and your action, and to the audience as well. We've come to the end of this part, and we are going to have some closing remarks so that we can wrap up by 10 o'clock. And it is a pleasure to welcome DanChurchAid, the closing remarks delivered by Birgit Kvist Sorensen. Thank you so very much. Secretary General of DanChurchAid. You can take your seats, please, while I introduce her. Thank you very much. And DanChurchAid, even for our online audience, a humanitarian and development NGO, you are supporting adaptation projects the world over. Come forward, please.
Thank you very much. I think actually when the business we're in, we have to be hopeful, otherwise we wouldn't be in this business. So I think that's a DNA inherent in organizations. Working with climate adaptation, working with the development and humanitarian assistance. So anyway, thank you very much to Denmark and Bangladesh for taking the leadership and hosting this event. Thank you to everybody who's contributed and participated and online as well. I think we all know that, I'm so old, I remember when we talked about that adaptation wasn't really necessary. As long as we put finance into mitigation, it would all be solved. I think we're way past that. And I think today it shows clearly that it's not an issue of mitigation or adaptation or loss and damage. But if we don't focus and we don't have finance for adaptation, the bill for loss and damage is going to be excruciating high. So we need to do something. So did we get any suggestions and proposals today? That's always the hard bit. I think we did. I think that the message to the COP is that we need to set a clear goal. We need to be clear on the definitions. What is it we're talking about? And then there's a huge issue of access. In where I work, locally led adaptation is that's where it's actually happening. But there is a huge access issue that we also heard from the previous speakers. And then there's the issue of ownership. I mean, I think in DanChurchAid, we also suffer from that. We have all the good ideas, and then we bring them to our partners and see this is what we could do. I think we really need to learn much more about ownership and the people. It's about they know what can be done, and I think it's certainly a challenge for many of us to listen and to learn. So I hope that's something that we will bring with us to the COP. So I think there was a lot of recommendations. I think the picture of the North Star is interesting. Let's walk together. And then to end it saying it's about people, it's about justice, it's about global solidarity. So thank you very much for being here today and listening in. And let's carry those messages forward to COP28.
I can see you really don't want to leave, but you may go. Thank you so much.